In the American justice system, a verdict is supposed to be the end, a conclusion after the legal battle. But in the case of Caylee Anthony, the verdict was just the beginning of a much darker and more complex story. It wasn't just a courtroom decision, it was a spark that ignited a public war. The real war had just begun. A war for the narrative, the public's trust, or for a family torn apart by secrets and lies. On July 5th, 2011, as the gavel fell, it marked the official conclusion of a legal trial. But the real collision was yet to come. A collision between family trauma, media warfare, and the very concept of justice itself. A dysfunctional family turned crime scene. A broken narrative, twisted beyond recognition. This wasn't just a case about what happened to Caylee Anthony. It was about the stories we tell and the stories we bury. Welcome back. Today we aren't just reciting the timeline. We are analysing the collision of trauma and justice. We are going to compare the shifting stories, specifically the explosive new claims Caylee made in her 2022 documentary, accusing her father of murder. We will play the devil's advocate. What if she is telling the truth? We will also dive into the psychology of trauma. Does a history of abuse actually explain why a mother would party while her child was missing? Or is that just a convenient excuse for a sociopath? To understand the collision at the heart of this tragedy, we need to go back further. Long before the media circus, long before the trial, Caylee Anthony was already weaving a web of lies and deceptions, a pattern that had emerged in her teenage years. By all accounts, she was a bright, personable girl, the kind you'd expect to see at the head of the class. But beneath the charm, cracks began to show long before 2008. High school friends and family remember the first signs of trouble. Small lies at first, but soon they escalated into elaborate fabrications designed to avoid the consequences of her actions. The most telling moment came when her parents attended her high school graduation, only to discover that Caylee hadn't actually earned her diploma. She was several credits short and had stopped attending classes months before. Yet, she let them buy the cape and gown, drove them to the ceremony, and allowed them to sit proudly in the stands. A cruel deception that would set the tone for the years to come. By 2008, Caylee was no longer a teenager playing small games of denial. She was a 22-year-old woman whose entire world was built on a foundation of lies. She claimed to work as an event planner at Universal Studios, but that was a fabrication. She claimed to leave her daughter, Caylee, with a nanny named Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez. But that, too, was another lie. In truth, Caylee had been unemployed for years, stealing money from friends and family to sustain a lifestyle she couldn't afford. This need to maintain a perfect image while living a chaotic, unstable life would ultimately define the investigation into Caylee's disappearance. We have to treat the Anthony family dynamic not just as a backstory, but as the primary crime scene. The lies, the denial, the fractured relationships were all part of a larger pattern. Cindy, the matriarch, is often described by those close to her as controlling, suffocating even. Trauma experts talk about something called triangulation, a toxic dynamic where one person pits two others against each other to maintain control. In 2008, Caylee Anthony didn't just allegedly kill her child, she triangulated her entire family into the crime. She used Cindy's denial to undermine George's authority. She manipulated Lee's loyalty, pitting it against the police. When the justice system stepped in, it wasn't just about a murder case. It was about untangling a lifetime of pathological lies, codependency, and buried trauma. But as we'll see, what was once a tragic accident quickly transformed into a nightmare of accusations, with a new, more sinister story emerging, one that would haunt the Anthony family for years to come. Now, let's explore how the story itself shifted over time, especially the narratives Caylee Anthony spun in 2011 during her trial, and later in 2022 during her documentary. This war of narratives reveals more about the survivor and less about the crime itself. In 2011, Casey's defense attorney, Jose Baez, laid out a story designed to provoke sympathy, a tragic tale of an accidental death. He claimed Caylee drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008. It was a death not caused by Caylee, but by a tragic accident. But here's where the defense theory took a twist. Baez painted George Anthony as a man whose emotions got the better of him. In a panic, he disposed of Caylee's body and covered it up. But the trauma angle here was pivotal. Baz argued that Caylee didn't call 911 because she had been conditioned by years of sexual abuse, which distorted her perception of normal reactions. But in 2022, everything changed. Caylee dropped a bombshell in her documentary, Where the Truth Lies. The story that was once an accident became an outright murder. Now, she wasn't just grieving a lost child. She claimed she woke up from a nap with Caylee missing. In her 2022 retelling, she found George holding Caylee's body, soaking wet. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. She said George had smothered Caylee with a pillow. The chilling accusation. He then handed her the body and said, "It's your fault." She had to follow his orders because, as she claimed, he was the cop. The narrative had shifted from an accidental death to a calculated cover-up by the very man who was supposed to protect her. The investigation into the disappearance of Caylee Anthony began on June 16, 2008, the last day Caylee was seen alive. It started with a family dispute. Caylee Anthony had been accused of stealing money from her mother, Cindy. In the aftermath of the argument, Caylee packed a bag, took Caylee, and left. For the next month, life seemingly went on for Caylee. She was seen shopping, partying at nightclubs, and getting a tattoo that read Bella Vita, beautiful life. But as the days passed, friends and family began asking, where was Caylee? Caylee always had an answer. She told them Caylee was with a nanny named Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez, or Zanny. On July 15, 2008, Cindy, desperate to see her granddaughter, tracked Caylee down. She found Caylee's car at a tow yard. Upon opening the door, she was struck by a foul odour, a smell that Cindy would later describe in a frantic 911 call.
There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car.
Cindy forced Caylee to return home and immediately called the police. It was only then, after weeks of evasion, that Caylee finally admitted she hadn't seen her daughter in over a month. But for police, this would be just the beginning of an investigation filled with lies and misdirection. Caylee quickly led investigators down a series of false leads. She took them to Universal Studios, claiming she worked there. But as she walked through the halls, waving to non-existent co-workers, she suddenly admitted that she hadn't worked there in years. Then, Caylee directed police to the nanny's apartment, a place that had been vacant for months. The police realised Caylee was not helping them find her daughter. She was leading them on a wild goose chase, and with each new lie, they were further from the truth. Weeks passed with little progress. Then, on August 11, 2008, a local meter reader, Roy Cronk, spotted something suspicious in the wooded area near the Anthony family home. Over the next few days, Cronk called police multiple times, reporting what appeared to be a skull near a grey bag. Despite his persistence, the sheriff's office didn't take immediate action. On December 11, 2008, Cronk called once again. This time, the police responded, and this time they found what he had been reporting. The remains of a child, wrapped in a trash bag, lay in the forest. Investigators recovered duct tape, still attached to hair found with the skull, along with tissue. Over the next 4 days, more bones were found scattered nearby. The remains were confirmed to be those of Caylee Anthony on December 19, 2008. The death was ruled a homicide, but the cause remained undetermined. The discovery marked the beginning of the final chapter in the investigation, but the questions surrounding Caylee's death and the lies that led to the tragic conclusion were only beginning to unfold. Now let's step into the uncomfortable shoes of the devil's advocate. What if Caylee is telling the truth? What if her story about George actually holding Caylee's body is the real truth? Does it hold up against the physical evidence? First, let's talk about the wet clothes. If Caylee was drowned, intentionally or not, her clothes would be soaked. But there's a catch. The decomposition was way too advanced by the time the body was found to confirm whether she was buried in wet clothes. And what about the duct tape found on Caylee's skull? Caylee claims George staged the scene to make it look like a kidnapping. Was the duct tape added after death? This could be the behaviour of someone desperately trying to cover their tracks. And then there's the 31 days, the most disturbing part of this entire tragedy. If Caylee was indeed a victim of trauma, could fear have paralysed her? Could she have dissociated to the point where she ignored her daughter's disappearance in order to survive? Then there's the chilling search history found on Caylee's computer. The term foolproof suffocation staring back at investigators, recorded long before Caylee's death. If Caylee wasn't the mastermind behind her daughter's demise, what does this search say about the actions that led to Caylee's death? Was it premeditation or a desperate attempt to cover up an accident? Experts suggest this could be the fawn response, a type of trauma reaction where the victim appeases the aggressor in order to survive. In Caylee's case, did she suppress the reality of her daughter's death, hiding it behind a facade of partying? Dr. Jeffrey Danziger, who studied Caylee, argued that her behaviour may reflect compartmentalisation, the ability to split reality into fragments to avoid overwhelming pain. Caylee may have lived in a fantasy reality where everything appeared fine, even as her daughter lay dead. Her tattoo, the Bella Vita, beautiful life, wasn't a celebration of her daughter's death. It was an attempt to escape the trauma. It was a desperate plea to find a glimmer of normalcy, to pretend that everything was okay. But for some, this is seen as pathological lying, as manipulative as it is monstrous. The contradiction is jarring. Was she dissociating or simply celebrating freedom from a life she never truly wanted? The counter-argument. Of course, there's a simpler explanation. According to Occam's razor, perhaps Caylee wasn't dissociating. Maybe she was simply celebrating. The prosecution argued that her actions during those 31 days were far too calculated, too deliberate, and crucially, too joyous to be attributed to trauma. In their view, she wasn't a passive victim of abuse, numb and following orders. She was a woman savouring her newfound freedom, free from the constraints of responsibility and consequence. If the courtroom was the battleground, the media was the war zone. The Caylee Anthony case didn't just dominate the legal landscape. It became the case of the decade in the court of public opinion. Every moment, every detail was scrutinised, twisted, and broadcasted to millions. As the story of a missing toddler turned into a high-stakes legal drama, the public eagerly consumed a narrative far more sensational than any defence or prosecution could present. As the trial played out, the media didn't just report the case, they shaped it. Headlines turned Caylee from a grieving mother into a monster. Every tear, every moment of laughter was dissected. The verdict may have acquitted her in court, but in the court of public opinion, she was already guilty. The media found its villain, and that villain was Caylee. And for Caylee Anthony, the media become both the judge and executioner. In a way, the real trial was not just Caylee's, but her family's too. The media quickly picked sides. Caylee became the scapegoat, a reckless mother who showed no remorse. Her family, particularly George, became collateral damage. Every new accusation, whether rooted in truth or speculation, was amplified by the unrelenting spotlight of the media machine. For George, this relentless scrutiny was devastating. In the months leading up to the trial, whispers of his alleged involvement in Caylee's death began circulating. The defence's narrative that George was an abusive father, possibly responsible for Caylee's death, found fertile ground in the public's imagination. As the cameras zoomed in on George's every expression, the accusations grew bolder. Was he guilty? Had he truly disposed of Caylee's body as the defence claimed? And if so, why was he hiding the truth? The accusations against George took a toll far beyond the public arena. In 2009, overwhelmed by the shame of the scrutiny, he attempted suicide, an act that would haunt him for years. The constant media barrage had left him broken, emotionally and physically. His life, once defined by his law enforcement career, had become a public spectacle, a man in mourning, torn between protecting his daughter and defending his integrity. The media didn't just affect George, it affected everyone in the family. Cindy, who had initially stood by Casey, became increasingly isolated in her support. The public's fury was overwhelming. She faced constant questions. Was she complicit? Did she protect her daughter's lies? Cindy's need for denial, the idea that Casey was simply the victim of a miscarriage of justice, became harder to sustain in the face of public rejection. She felt the overwhelming pressure to protect Casey from the media's venom, even as her own reputation was tarnished by the very same press. And then there is Casey. After the trial, when the verdict was handed down, she was legally acquitted. But in the eyes of the public, she was anything but free. The verdict might have ended the legal battle, but the media machine kept her locked away in a prison of public perception. While she was celebrated by some as a woman who had been unjustly persecuted, others continued to label her a murderer, a sociopath who escaped justice. In the years that followed, the narrative around Casey would shift, but only to another form of media spectacle. In 2022, her documentary aired, and she went public with new claims, accusing George of being responsible for Caylee's death. The media devoured this new twist, and once again, Casey found herself in the centre of a frenzied storm, this time with her father as the alleged murderer. For Casey, the media's influence is undeniable. They are her shadow, a reflection of the narrative she herself created, but one that has become beyond her control. Each headline, new accusation, only adds layers to the tangled mess of truth, lies, and trauma that she has been living with for so long. As time passed, the rift between Casey and her parents grew wider, fracturing what little remained of their family. This wasn't just a fallout from a trial. It was the erosion of trust, love, and the painful aftermath of a tragedy that none of them could escape. It's clear that, even before the trial, the foundation of the Anthony family was already crumbling. But the verdict only deepened the divide. For George and Cindy, Casey's acquittal was not a moment of relief. It was a gut punch. They had spent months believing in their daughter's innocence, only to have that belief shattered in the face of the public spectacle. They stood up by her every lie, every defence, but when the cameras stopped rolling, they were left to pick up the pieces of a family that would never be whole again. Cindy, for years, remained unwavering in her defence of Casey, even to the point of denial. In interviews, she continued to describe her daughter as a victim, someone who had been caught in an impossible situation. But even Cindy couldn't hold the illusion together forever. By 2017, her tone had shifted. She seemed exhausted, a woman trying to reconcile the incongruity of loving her daughter while grappling with the possibility that Casey had been involved in her granddaughter's death. George, once a man of authority, a former cop trained to keep his emotions in check, found himself in freefall. The relentless media scrutiny, coupled with the accusations made by his own daughter, tore him apart. The man who once wore a badge now found himself at the mercy of public opinion, and it nearly destroyed him. In an interview with Crime Watch Daily, he revealed his anger towards Casey, admitting that he could no longer look at her the same way. It was clear that for George, the verdict wasn't a moment of vindication. It was a reminder of everything he had lost. The accusations against George, particularly the ones Casey made in her 2022 documentary, didn't just affect her relationship with him, they shattered it entirely. In Where the Truth Lies, Casey accused her father of being involved in Caylee's death, alleging that he smothered her with a pillow. For George, this was the final blow. The accusations sent shockwaves through the Anthony family, but it was the public fallout that may have been most devastating. George and Cindy were left to answer for the daughter who had accused them both of terrible things. And no matter how many polygraphs George passed, no matter how much Cindy stood by her daughter, the public couldn't unhear the words Casey had spoken on camera. They were forever branded as the family that had lost their granddaughter. And now their daughter was accusing them of being complicit in her death. While Casey spun her narrative in the media, George and Cindy Anthony were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their family. Their journey through denial, grief, and ultimately rage has been as public as their daughter's trial. In 2011, just months after the verdict, George and Cindy appeared on Dr. Phil. Cindy clung to the hope that Casey had been in a fugue state, a mental condition that could explain her actions. But George, his grief had turned to anger. He famously admitted, "I don't know if Casey was innocent." By 2017, George's anger was clear. During a Crime Watch Daily interview, he stated bluntly, "She doesn't need to exist anymore." The pressure had shattered him, revealing that in 2009 he had even attempted suicide, overwhelmed by the shame of everything that had unfolded. After Casey's documentary aired, George and Cindy decided to fight back, not just to clear their names, but to wrest control over the narrative that had defined their lives for over a decade. Their weapon? Science. They agreed to take a polygraph test. The questions were direct and brutal. Did you suffocate Caylee? Did you touch Casey inappropriately? The results were a shocking vindication for George. The polygraph showed he was truthful. For the first time in 15 years, there was an objective measure that supported George's version of events over his daughter's. Here lies the paradox at the heart of the Caylee Anthony case. The legal system worked, but society failed. When the jury delivered their verdict on July 5th, 2011, not guilty, the legal machinery of the United States justice system had done its job. The prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defence had raised enough uncertainty to protect Caylee from conviction. This was a textbook application of the legal principle that an accused person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. But legal principles, while necessary, are not moral absolutes. The verdict that cleared Caylee's name in the eyes of the law did not bring closure for her family, or for the public. Because while the justice system may have fulfilled its mandate, society was left in a state of emotional disarray. The question of what really happened to Caylee Anthony remains an unanswered void, and with that, so many truths, both painful and unheeded, persist. Public opinion was decided long before the trial ended. The media circus had already painted Caylee as a monster, a mother who had danced and partied while her child was missing. This narrative was irrevocably lodged in the collective consciousness, and no legal verdict could change it. The media constructed its own trial, one where Caylee's guilt was self-evident, even if the legal system couldn't prove it. For many, the real justice was found in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, a space where doubt was seen as a confirmation of guilt. But in the end, the justice system, flawed as it is, had no other choice but to follow the law. The prosecution overcharged, failed to prove intent, and didn't provide enough direct evidence of murder. The jury, following their instructions, made the only decision they could under the law. Caylee Anthony was not guilty of murder. But here's the unsettling reality. The system, by its very nature, only addresses legal guilt, not moral guilt. It was never designed to tackle the complex, raw emotions that an event like this stirs in the public, and more importantly, in those directly involved. In a system that demands beyond reasonable doubt, to convict truth becomes an elusive concept. Justice, in this case, was not about what was morally or emotionally just. It was about what could be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt. Caylee walks free today, legally exonerated. But the public remains divided. Some see her as a wronged woman, a victim of a broken justice system. Others see her as a murderer who outsmarted the system, and her freedom a stain on the integrity of the courts. For many, the truth remains elusive, suspended in the gap between legal fact and emotional reality. The greatest tragedy here is not that Caylee was acquitted, but that Caylee never received justice. She remains the one casualty in all of this, the child who died, her life a puzzle that will never be fully solved. The legal system, with its rules and procedures, couldn't give us the answers we needed. The media, with its need for a story, couldn't provide the truth. And society, with its rush to judgment, couldn't heal the wounds that this case exposed. In the end, the greatest tragedy isn't just that Caylee's killer remains a mystery. It's that the system, designed to deliver justice, couldn't address the emotional truths that haunted a family already torn apart. While the law may have spoken, it left behind a cavernous silence, the truth forever out of reach. Caylee Anthony walks free today, but she lives in a prison of her own making, a prison built not of bars, but of lies, trauma, and the haunting silence of those 31 days. If this story unsettled you, that's the point. True crime confronts us with uncomfortable questions about truth, justice, and the stories we choose to believe. Which narrative do you find more plausible? Caylee as a traumatised, dissociating victim of abuse, or Caylee as a calculating manipulator who escaped accountability? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to keep exploring the truth behind true crime cases, be sure to hit like and subscribe to Controversial Crimes.